There is a sound the executioners of Paris had never heard. It is not a scream. It is not a cry for mercy. It is not the fearful silence of someone who knows they are about to die. It is singing, a sacred hymn in Latin sung by 16 women walking toward the guillotine as though they were approaching an altar. And each time the blade drops, the singing carries on with one fewer voice. Yet it continues. The crowd does not know how to respond. For months they have cheered executions, hurling insults, calling for more blood. But today they are quiet. What they are seeing does not make sense. These are the Carmelites of Compiègne. 16 cloistered nuns who had not left their convent for decades. And today the revolution will execute them for it. One of them is called Constance. Music, 29 years old, the youngest. She spent 9 years without stepping outside the convent. The first thing she sees of the outside world is the guillotine, and she is the first to mount the scaffold. Before moving toward the blade, Constance kneels before an older woman. At the end of the line, the priest, and asks, "Permission to die, mother." The priest strokes her face. "Go, my child." Music. Constance kisses a small statue with a virgin concealed in the prioress's hand, gently pushes past the executioner, and walks to the guillotine singing. She is the first. She will not be the last. What unfolds over the next hour will leave Paris silent. A city obsessed with executions, frozen into silence by 16 women who refuse to stop singing. This is not a legend. It happened on July 17, 1794 at the bloodiest height of the French Revolution. And 10 days later, Maxime La Robespierre, the most powerful man in France, the one who signed their death sentence, climbed those same steps. The man who built the empire of the guillotine died beneath its blade. But what no one tells you is what happened before that scaffold. How 16 women who had never known violence were torn from their homes, stripped of everything they believed in, and ordered to renounce their faith or die. They chose death. But not before making a vow that would haunt the revolution for centuries. This is Torture Diary, and this is what truly happened. If these stories matter to you, support us with a like and subscribe. By 1794, France had lost its mindestens. What began as a revolution for liberty had turned into a machinery of death. The pledges of freedom and equality were drowned in blood. A man named Maximilien Robespierre controlled the Committee of Public Safety. And he saw enemies everywhere. Aristocrats hiding in attics, priests holding secret masses, anyone who failed to cheer loudly enough at public executions. The answer was simple. Kill them all. Let fate decide the rest. Except Robespierre did not believe in God. In less than a year, the Revolutionary Tribunal sent more than 17,000 people to the guillotine. In Paris, executions took place every day, sometimes 30 music people, in a single afternoon. The executioners developed a routine. Load, position, drop, next. When efficient, they could kill a person every 2 minutes. The Place d'Outre-Honves, where the Carmelites would die, executed a total of 306 people in just 6 weeks. The ground became so soaked that pools of blood gathered between the cobblestones. Neighbors submitted formal complaints about the smell. The odor of death had become a public nuisance. But Robespierre held a particular hatred for one institution, the Catholic Church. He viewed it as an ally of the monarchy, a system that kept people ignorant and obedient. So he declared war on faith itself. Churches were shut down or transformed into temples of reason. Priests were forced to publicly renounce their vows or face the blade. Religious holidays were eliminated. Even the calendar was rewritten to erase any trace of Christian influence. And wearing a religious habit was now a crime punishable by death. For the 16 Carmelites living in their quiet convent in Compiègne, 50 miles from Paris, this was a death sentence waiting to be signed. In September 1792, soldiers arrived and expelled them from their home. The nuns were driven into the streets, forbidden to wear their habits, forbidden to live together. But Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, their prioress, refused to let the community dissolve. She found 4 small apartments in town where they could live in secrecy, continuing their prayers in whispers. Then she did something remarkable. she gathered her sisters and made a proposal. Would they be willing to offer their lives as a sacrifice for France? Not to seek death, but to accept it if it came, to offer their suffering so the bloodshed might end. Two of the older nuns hesitated. The idea felt like madness, but Mother Teresa gave them time to pray. Within hours, they returned asking forgiveness for their fear. The community voted unanimously. From that day on, every morning at 4 Uhr nachts, the Sechzehn Karmelites renewed their offering. They prayed that if their deaths could purchase peace for France, God would accept the sacrifice. They did not know when death would arrive. They only knew they were prepared. For 2 years they waited, praying, hiding, watching as the terror devoured everyone around them. Then in June 1794, someone spoke. Music. On June 21, 1794, soldiers broke down the door before dawn. Someone had music informed on them. A neighbor, a shopkeeper, someone ear for the reward the government paid for exposing hidden religious. 2 years of careful secrecy destroyed by a single whisper. The soldiers ransacked everything. They found letters, prayer books, religious medals, a small statue of the Virgin, proof that these women were still living as nuns. The charges were fanaticism and counter-revolutionary activity. In plain terms, their crime was praying. The 16 sisters were taken to a former convent, converted into a prison. The irony was merciless. Nuns imprisoned inside a building that had once sheltered women just like them. Yet, something unusual happened behind those walls. Other prisoners began to notice the Carmelites. In a place filled with despair, with people crying and losing their sanity to fear, these 16 women were different. They continued their prayers. They rose at 4 Uhr nachts as they always had. They sang hymns in their cells. They comforted others who were terrified. English Benedictine nuns imprisoned in the same building later wrote about them. They seemed to be preparing for a wedding, music, not an execution. On July 12, guards arrived to transport them to Paris for trial. There was a complication. Their civilian clothes were being washed, so they traveled wearing their religious habits. The very garments that were now illegal. The journey took hours in open carts. Some in the crowd shouted insults, but the Carmelites did not hide or shrink back. He read the charges in a dull voice as though reciting a shopping list. The Carmelites were accused of fanaticism, of concealing weapons, of supporting the monarchy, of corresponding with enemies of the Republic. The weapons charge would have been absurd if the consequences were not so deadly. The only items found in their apartments were religious medals, images of saints, prayer books, a rosary, a small statue of the Virgin Mary, dangerous contraband in the eyes of the revolution. But one moment stood apart. One exchange that witnesses would remember for years afterward. When Mother Teresa heard the word fanaticism, she interrupted the proceedings. The courtroom went silent. Defendants did not music interrupt. They stood quietly and accepted their fate. But Mother Teresa's voice was calm, almost music inquisitive. Please explain what you mean by that word. Viertenveil looked at her as though she were an insect that had dared to speak. He meant her attachment to childish beliefs in foolish, music, religious practices. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Everyone expected Mother Teresa to apologize, to plead, to defend herself. She smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a defiant one, but a peaceful smile, like someone who had just received confirmation of what she already knew. If believing in God was fanaticism, then yes, she was guilty. They all were, and they would die guilty with joy. The tribunal asked each nun the same question. Would you renounce your vows, deny your faith, and swear loyalty to the Republic? This was their final chance. The door stood open. One word, one simple rejection of everything they believed, and they could leave that courtroom alive. They could return to their families. They could live. Constance, the youngest, answered first, no. Sister Marie of the Incarnation, who had been a Carmelite for 30 years, no. Sister Euphrasia, who had hesitated when Mother Teresa first proposed the vow of sacrifice. No. One by one, 16 times the same answer. No. 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 The verdict. Music, death. Als 16. When the sentence was announced, the Carmelites did not cry. They did not collapse. They did not curse the judges or beg for mercy. They renewed their religious vows right there in music, the courtroom, in front of the men who had just condemned them. The same vows they had taken years earlier in the silence of their convent. The same vows the revolution had tried to erase. Then they began to sing the Tadem, a hymn of thanksgiving. They were thanking God for the privilege of dying for their faith. The guard stood motionless. Fauquierenville's face twisted in confusion. This was not how it was supposed to happen. Prisoners did not sing after being sentenced to death. Prisoners did not thank anyone for anything. But no one stopped them. Perhaps even the revolutionaries sensed they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. Something that made their documents, their tribunals, and their guillotine seem very, very small. July 17, 1794, late afternoon. The summer heat bore down on Paris and the stench at the plastron was unbearable. Weeks of daily executions and saturated the ground with blood. The 16 Carmelites were loaded into carts alongside 24 other condemned prisoners. From the very beginning, they were different. While cried or sat paralyzed in shock, the nuns sang for 3 hours through the streets of Paris. Their voices never faltered. The Miserie, the Salve Regina, the Tadam, music, ancient hymns Paris had not heard in years, echoing off buildings that had forgotten the sound of faith. People stopped to watch. Shopkeepers stepped out of their stores. Women leaned from windows. Children pointed and asked why those ladies were singing. Paris had witnessed thousands of prisoners hauled to their deaths. It had never seen anyone who looked peaceful, who looked almost joyful. When the carts finally reached the square, the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, was waiting. He had killed thousands. He had seen every reaction a human being could have when facing death. Fear, Rage, music, despair, défiance, collapse. He had never seen what he was about to witness. The nuns asked permission to sing one final hymn before the executions began. Sanson agreed. Perhaps he was curious. Perhaps even he felt something shift in that blood-soaked square. The Carmelites sang the Veni Creator Spiritus. Come Holy Spirit. 16 voices rising into the summer air. Then they renewed their vows one last time. Mother Teresa announced the order. Music, youngest to oldest. The youngest would die first. The oldest, including herself, would die last. This was intentional. The music older nuns would watch the younger ones go first, giving them strength with their presence until the very end. Constance stepped forward. 29 years old, 9 years in the convent. The first thing she had ever seen of the world beyond those walls was this square, this scaffold, this blade. She walked to Mother Teresa and knelt before her one final time. Music, permission to die, Mother. Mother Teresa looked at the young woman she had guided for years. The girl who had entered the convent as a teenager, who had surrendered everything for a life of prayer, who was now asking permission to surrender her life itself. Go, my daughter. Constance kissed the small terracotta statue and the Virgin that Mother Teresa had kept hidden in her palm. She rose and walked toward the scaffold. The executioner's assistant stepped forward to help her climb the steps. She waved them away. She did not need assistance. Constance climbed alone, took her place, looked at her sisters one last time, and continued singing until, music, the blade fell. The crowd was silent. No cheers, no insults, nothing. The singing went on with 15 voices. Sister St. Louis stepped forward and knelt. Permission to die, Mother. She kissed the statue. She climbed alone. The blade fell. 14 voices. Sister Euphrasia, permission to die, Mother. 13 voices, one after another. The same ritual, the same question, the same blessing, the same solitary walk to the scaffold, each nun pushing away the executioner's help, each nun singing until the blade cut her voice short. The crowd remained frozen. These were people who had watched Executions for amusement, who had cheered and jeered and demanded faster deaths. Now they stood in complete silence, watching 16 women turn a killing ground into something they could not name. 12 voices, 10, eat. Each execution lasted less than a minute. But to those watching, time seemed to stop. There was no mockery, no applause, no impatient cries to hurry. Only thousands of people standing motionless as 16 women transformed their deaths into something that looked like worship. Sister Julie of Jesus, a lay sister who had spent her life doing the convent's manual labor, climbed the scaffold with the same dignity as the choir nuns. She had never learned Latin. She had never studied theology. Yet, she sang the hymns from memory just as she had sung them every day for decades. Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified was 78 years old, music the eldest. She had been a Carmelite for more than 50 years. She had lived through wars, famines, and the fall of the monarchy. Now she stood before the executioner who would end her life. She paused and looked at him, not with hatred, not with fear. "I forgive you with all my heart," she said softly. "And I pray God forgives you as well." Charles Henry Sanson, the executioner, had heard thousands of final words, curses, prayers, screams, confessions. But this small elderly woman offering him forgiveness stopped him cold. She climbed the scaffold without assistance, still singing with what remained of her sisters. 5 voices, then 3, then 2, and finally only 1. Mother Teresa of St. Augustine stood alone in the square. She had watched 15 of her daughters die. She had blessed each one. She had held the statue they kissed. She had said, "Go, my child," 15 times. Music, now there was no one left to bless her, no one to grant her permission, music, no one to hold a statue for her to kiss. She looked out at the crowd, thousands of faces staring back in silence. She sang the final verse of the Salve Regina alone, her voice carried across the square, across the blood-soaked ground. Across the bodies of her sisters. Then she climbed the scaffold. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She placed herself beneath the blade, lifted her eyes to the sky, and the song ended. The blade fell, and Paris fell silent. Witnesses later wrote that it was the deepest silence they had ever known. In a city accustomed to death, one that had turned executions into public entertainment, 16 singing nuns had done the impossible. They had made Paris ashamed. The bodies of the 16 Carmelites were thrown into a mass grave at the Picpus cemetery alongside nearly 300 other victims of the terror. No markers, no ceremony, music, no prayers, just another heap of corpses in a city drowning in them. But something had fractured that afternoon, something the revolution could not mend. Witnesses could not stop speaking of what they had seen. In taverns and markets, in hushed conversations on street corners, people spoke of the 16 nuns who had walked to death singing. The calm on their faces, the way they had met the blade as if it were a gift. For months, Parisians had convinced themselves the executions were necessary, that the victims were enemies who deserved to die. But these women, what had they done except pray? The question lingered in the air like smoke that refused to fade. 10 days later on July 27, 1794, Robespierre was arrested. His own allies turned on him. Music, the architect of the terror, the man who had signed thousands of death warrants with an unshaken hand, suddenly stood on the other side. The next day, July 28, Maximilien Robespierre was dragged to the same scaffold where the Carmelites had sung. He did not sing. When the blade fell, witnesses said he screamed so loudly it echoed across the square. The reign of terror was finished. Coincidence? The revolutionaries who survived, music said yes. Just politics, just timing. The deaths of 16 nuns, they claimed, had nothing to do with the fall of Robespierre. But the people who had stood in that square were not so certain. Something had changed on July 17. The terror had fed on fear, and suddenly 16 women had shown that fear, music, could be overcome, that the guillotine held power only over the body, that everything could be taken from someone and still they could not be broken. The English Benedictines, who had been imprisoned with the Carmelites, survived the terror. When they were finally released, they discovered that the nuns' civilian clothing had been left behind. They preserved them as relics, sacred objects marked with the sweat and tears of martyrs. They spent the rest of their lives telling anyone who would listen what they had witnessed. The Catholic Church was slower to respond. For more than a century, Rome made no official statement about the Carmelites. Some historians believe the Church was ashamed of its failure to protect them. Others think the story was too politically dangerous for an institution trying to reconcile with France. It was not until 1906 that Pope Pius X beatified the 16 martyrs, and only in December 2024 did Pope Francis formally declare them saints. 230 years. That is how long it took the Church to officially acknowledge what the crowd in Paris understood in a single afternoon. There is a cemetery in Paris where the Carmelites are buried. Picpus hidden behind walls absent from tourist maps. Most Parisians have never heard of it, inside it is quiet. Trees, grass, a small chapel with music names carved into the wall. Nearly 300 names. Victims of the terror. Most of them forgotten. But 16 of those names still resonate. Constance, Marie, Julie, Teresa. Women who chose death over betrayal, who answered terror with song, who showed a city intoxicated by blood what courage truly looked like. Every July 17th, a small group gathers at Picpus. They light candles, they pray, and they sing the same hymns Constance and her sisters sang 230 music years ago. The Salve Regina, the Veni Creator. Voices in a silent cemetery preserving the memory of voices that once silenced a screaming crowd. 16 women who believed their sacrifice could end a massacre. Were they right? Did their deaths stop the terror? History cannot prove it, but this much we know. 10 days after they died, the architect of the terror died on the same scaffold. And 230 years later, people still remember the names of 16 singing nuns. While the names of their executioners have faded into nothing, maybe that is the only answer that matters. Maybe the true victory is not survival. It is being remembered for what you refuse to surrender. This is Torture Diary. We do not sanitize history. We show you what truly happened. If you want more stories. The World tried to parry, subscribe and leave a comment.